Thank you and welcome to this week's video, and apologies first of all for my slightly croaky voice. I do have a bit of a cold, so my sincere apologies. Anyway, this week we're looking at a painting by Károly Ferenczy, a painting of the Sermon on the Mountain, which we've chosen for the Feast of All Saints. So who was Károly Ferenczy? He initially studied law and economy, and then he moved to Paris, where he attended various academies, and he stayed basically in Paris for 3 years, where he was working close to sort of the French tradition of painting, and there he learned how to paint and represent his keen interest for nature. And he was one of these painters who really took his painting palette, his paints and his canvases out in nature. So he's very known for painting en plein air, as they call it, so outside. He's also considered the father of modern Hungarian painting, and the last thing I think, which encapsulates his oeuvre, is that he paints with high naturalism, and it borders on sort of impressionism, and I think this painting here is quite a good example of that. So as I mentioned, his preoccupation for nature and landscape paintings is obvious here, but looking closer at the subject matter, what can we say? Well, it basically represents one of Jesus's teachings, which is traditionally referred to as the Sermon on the Mountain, in which Christ enunciated the Beatitudes. Yeah, Jesus never preached from the pulpit ex cathedra, rather he taught his disciples in the open air, on the banks of a lake or even in a boat. So the Sermon on the Mountain is recounted in only one of the Gospels, the Gospel according to Matthew, and that's chapters 5 to 7, and only partially in the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 6. So Matthew wrote that the Beatitudes were announced by Jesus on a mountain, and traditionally it is called Mount of the Beatitudes. So where Jesus was amongst crowds and where he healed the sick, and Christ withdrew his followers to a mountain near the Sea of Galilee. So it's basically a common theme throughout our history, and just before we delve into this particular painting, I just want to show you how an earlier artist treated the same subject matter, and here we're showing a painting by Karl Heinrich Bloch, and that's a painting from 1877, so about 20 years before the painting that we're currently looking at. And there you can see it's still a much more traditional way of painting, but I think equally striking, to be perfectly honest. And then secondly, we've chosen to show you a slightly later version, a slightly later treatment of the Sermon on the Mount. This is a painting from 1922 by Robin Guthrie, and as you can see, it is quite a striking painting too. So what are the Beatitudes? Well, basically the sermon that Christ gives the central ethics of Christianity, and it is a development of the law of Moses. The Beatitudes are at the heart of Jesus' preaching, and they take up the promises made to the chosen people since Abraham. So the Beatitudes fulfill the promises by ordering them no longer merely to the possession of a territory, but to the kingdom of heaven. And so when we listen to the Beatitudes and what Christ said, we know absolutely and exactly what he means. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. And then, etc., etc. So blessed are the merciful, blessed are the clean of heart, blessed are the peacemakers. And here basically we see the audience in the painting listening to Christ and taking it all in. So let's look a bit closer at the actual composition of the painting. Looking at the painting from a distance, you can almost divide it in two, where the top half of the painting would be entirely sort of depicting nature and trees and mountains, and the bottom half is really where all the figures are concentrated. Then the row sort of figures all dressed in these white clothes divide sort of the top half from the bottom half. So the painter would for sure have chosen white colors to make that division even stronger, basically. Just on the note of nature, it is interesting to note that some critics at the time noted that the predominance of the nature in the painting, so basically this whole top half of the painting, in which they saw a sign of mankind's subordination to the elements. It's probably not entirely correct, given that Ferenczy emphasizes the group of people, but still, nature is very predominant in this painting. The other thing I find worth noting is that we see Jesus here being depicted from the back. We don't see his face, we just see his back, and also Jesus is placed sort of amongst the people, so he's not preaching on top of a mountain down to people. No, he's sort of placed sitting at the same level of all his audience, basically, of all the people who look at it. And the painting I showed you earlier, the Karl Heinrich Bloch painting, basically there Jesus is depicted on top of the mountain, so basically with preaching with authority. And here the artist does have a different take on the same subject matter. And then the other thing worth noting in my point of view is that the figure in the foreground to the left is almost placed as a mirror of Jesus in the composition. So he's just leaning his right hand on the grass. He also is sort of being depicted from the back. So Jesus and men are basically depicted at the same level. Yeah, so in conclusion, I think this is an absolutely beautiful painting and a very moving scene. It's also worth noting that unlike in traditional religious painting, you don't see any sacred attributes here. Like, for example, there's no halo above Jesus's head. However, what we do see is that Christ's two hands is showing the inside of his two hands, almost knowing as what is to happen and to come to those hands. So the whole composition looks very human, and yet nature confirms it, some gravity. It's also worth noting, just for the little story, that at the time when this was painted, people were saying that it was actually his family members, his direct family members, that were depicted in the painting, which is not really that unusual for artists to do, but yeah, so probably all these figures could be identified with a bit of study. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this week's video, and yeah, look forward to you tuning into our next video. Thank you.